Hi, I'm Rob Price, and I'm talking to CEOs about AI. Welcome to Futurize.
I'm Steve Yemm, and I'm the Member of Parliament for Mansfield.
Steve, it's fantastic to have you on the podcast today, and indeed recording it in Mansfield as
Absolutely.
well. So we've got something in common because we've both got a passion around the town, having both grown up here.
Yes.
One of the things that I'm always intrigued by is how people end up doing the things that they do. And the opportunities that, I mean, we are going to come back to the East Midlands as a region, as a community. But tell the listeners a bit more about your background, how you got to doing what you're doing today.
Well, I grew up here in Mansfield. I was born in Reneth, as we call it locally. And so, look, I went to school here and all the rest of it. And of course, there's a kind of bigger story around that. We went to the same school as well, to Brunts, here in Mansfield, I think. But I got really interested in science when I was at primary school, when I was at Heathlands, mainly because my mum and dad bought me a chemistry set for my 7th birthday, and that kind of sparked an interest and kind of got me going, thinking about that. So when I left school, I became a scientist. I worked in the pharmaceutical industry. It took me into areas like chemical and biological informatics and IT and so forth, and really took me into a kind of more of a commercial and business leadership type of role in the UK and then all over the world. So quite a lot of time in the United States, and that's what I did before I decided to stand for Parliament a few years back. It's always been an interest of mine. I've been a member of the Labour Party since I was a teenager here in Mansfield. So it's always been kind of on the horizon, a kind of more political life. But that's kind of what led me in that direction, if you like.
And the thing that I loved about our conversation that we had a few months ago was I told you about the podcast and told you that I talked to chief execs of AI businesses and about this kind of mad world of tech.
Yeah.
And of course, you've done that. You've done that role in the US. And as you say, now got a responsibility from a policy point of view and understanding how we as the country and we within the region can take advantage of that.
Yeah. It's an unusual background for a politician. There aren't many former chief execs and chief commercial officers on the green benches at all, and there aren't enough scientists in there. There are more, actually. I think the newest intake of MPs, there are quite a number of scientists. Good to see that. I think, my own perspective of as a scientist, and I still think of myself that way, is that it brings a certain degree of analysis and rational analysis to policy making. And I think, putting that together with a perspective around business leadership means that, it's a different kind of level of input to policy making.
And I think from a personal point of view, one of the things that I've seen for a long time is the degree of complexity about the current wave of technology that's happening. Yes, it's very consumer friendly in the sense that we can all go on to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever we use. Yeah. But in terms of understanding what that means to government, to citizens, to businesses, how it will have a fundamental transformational, not that we know the answers yet.
Yeah, sure.
I think it's critical to actually have people kind of with that depth of understanding. But how do we navigate through that? And let's start with the East Midlands. I mean, or whether Mansfield or beyond. But how do we make sure that this kind of there's a cohort of people who are supported and passionate about wanting to develop careers in this space?
Well, I think there is a kind of real lack of understanding of how quickly things are moving, about the opportunities that this provides, and about the extent to which there's some danger of regional inequality as well. So I think it is really important when we think about the East Midlands in particular and other regions that are not in the kind of golden triangle space, if you like, the kind of Oxford, Cambridge, London nexus that I've worked in for some time. When I came back from the United States, I was in that world for maybe the last 4 or 5 years. It's a very different world to the East Midlands. So I think we have to think about tech policy is really economic policy. Economic policy is in many respects social policy when you think about inequality. Inequality in terms of economic development is a really dangerous thing in a lot of ways. It's not just a question about equity, it's a question about economic capacity. There's only a certain degree to which you can continually heat up certain parts of the country. And so I think those questions around economic policy relate to tech policy as well. And the big ones are, do you get the skills right? Do you get public investment right? Will private sector investment follow that? And do you get the infrastructure right? And they are questions that apply to any type of economic development. And I think that they remain some of the most pertinent questions for tech development across the regions. Whether that's kind of if you think about AI in particular and what do IT advances mean for economic growth, but I think they apply broadly across other areas of science as well. If you think about the field that I've been in life sciences, it's also, we've seen a geographical concentration over the last few decades, where the East Midlands, I could make an argument the East Midlands has been left behind in that. We've seen organisations like AstraZeneca, for instance, concentrate in Cambridge, where they used to be in Loughborough. We've seen an organisation like Boots really sell out its science capacity and see that moved around the globe. So, we've fallen behind, and we need to make sure that we don't do that in tech.
I guess one of the potential advantages of the current wave is that because a lot of those AI tools, large language models, other models, are generally available, you don't necessarily have to have the level of infrastructure to bring people and coalesce them around, because people, wherever they are, can do things.
Yeah.
Then it's about inspiration and skills transfer and training opportunities to get scale.
It is, but it's also to some extent about ambition as well. And the discussions that I have with local businesses are very different to ones that I might have with a business in Cambridge. If you're in Cambridge, you have an appetite for growing rapidly. You have an appetite for taking on external funding and investment. We have some really great companies here in Mansfield who are on that journey, but there aren't enough of them. And I often find that there is a more conservative culture around growing our growing our company more slowly, about wanting to retain complete ownership. And I think, if I say something to businesses here, it's business is a land grab when you're doing something, when you're building a market, and you have to go quickly. And don't be content with growing slowly, be more ambitious. Think about how you can double your revenue every year rather than growing by 5 or 10%, and don't be content with building £1 million business. We have some businesses here in Mansfield who have been on that journey. They are doubling their revenue every year, and I'd like to see more of that kind of thinking here and in the East Midlands more generally.
And I think that touches back on. I mean, you earlier you said you've worked in the US.
Yeah.
I've got a business in the US.
Yeah.
I know that the risk appetite for businesses in the US is utterly different from the UK.
Yes.
Investment appetite, the way in which kind of growth is driven. Now, I've heard some really positive messages over the last kind of few months. Kanishka Narayan in terms of kind of explaining the new strategy around tech, a desire to drive change.
Yeah.
What do you from an East Midlands point of view? How does that kind of real boil down for what needs to change? Well, is it just appetite, culture, risk, bravery, ambition to use your word?
It's some of those things, but I think it also comes down to the attitude of the state. And like you, I've been on that kind of journey in the United States. My life has really been one of culture shock in a way. You know, it was a culture shock when I went to Brunt's. It was a culture shock when I started work. It was a culture shock working in the United States because it's a very different environment. And one of the biggest differences for me as someone who's worked in a startup in Connecticut is the attitude and the appetite of the state to invest in the United States and to be ahead of private and venture capital and so forth. I think that's very different. And we think of the United States as being the home of private capital, of entrepreneurial risk-taking, of a small state and so forth. But my experience in the United States is actually the state was willing to come in and invest on the basis that, if you're part of a startup in Branford, Connecticut, and Branford, a lot of parallels, it's a former mining and textiles town, small town, but actually the state of Connecticut was prepared to say, we're going to invest in your company on the basis that you're going to keep 100 jobs in Branford in tech. And then on the back of that state investment, you have the private sector is prepared to come in, and venture money and so forth will come in on the back of it. But actually, to get that happening in Branford rather than in Santa Clara, the Connecticut state legislature understands that they need to pump prime that. I think we need to think a lot more about how do we get startup and scaling up businesses, particularly outside the Golden Triangle, who don't always, understand that, have the appetite for it. How do we get them thinking in that way, not just a change in culture, but actually a way in which the state works with them and actually goes on that journey with them? And, I saw a lot of that in the US. I think there's a lot of that goes on in other parts of Europe. I think Germany is particularly good at that. I think one of the things that I see with state investment in the UK is it tends to go into that Golden Triangle and the private money follows it. And actually, if you see what Germany did, they did exactly the opposite. When Germany was unified, they did exactly the opposite. And we need to think about our regions in exactly the same way as Germany thought about East Germany, or in fact, in the way that taxpayers in California might think about Michigan or Connecticut and so forth. So I think we need a more active state, essentially.
It's a great parallel. I mean, in terms of to very much look at it in that transformation and change at a regional level of the industries and the opportunities for people.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
If we turn it round to look at it from somebody in school or coming through higher education of whatever form it takes. I mean, I had a conversation this week with somebody 3 years into their career, and they were saying, I kind of don't know where I need to go. What do I need to do? What are the jobs that are going to sustain whilst AI continues to do more?
Sure. Yeah.
And I think that's a great question.
Yeah, it
I
is.
mean, my advice to my niece, for example, was do what you're passionate about. Because if you continue to progress and you continue to enthuse, at least you've got that desire to kind of do more.
Yeah.
But I guess what would we say in the schools if we went back to Brunts tomorrow to guide people in terms of what are those opportunities? Because I'm damn sure that there are people in those schools in Mansfield that are just as capable as any schools anywhere else.
Definitely.
If they only knew the route to get those opportunities.
Yeah. Well, look, I think there needs to be more opportunity for a start. It is not just a question of recognising the route. I think that there's a lot that can be done to signpost and point those out. But I don't think there are enough opportunities in areas like ours to have that type of experience. Now, when I left Brunts, I could go and work for Boots, right? I could, as an 18-year-old, I could go and work in the pharmaceutical industry. They would send me to do my degree on a day release. I don't think enough of those opportunities exist. Not enough of them exist in the country, actually, but there are certainly not enough of them here in the East Midlands and Mansfield. And so one of the things that I'm continually saying to industry is, if you want people with the right skills, you need to play a much bigger part in that. And for instance, I've said to the pharmaceutical industry, you need to offer those types of opportunities to people that are not available today. Today, if I wanted to do what I did 30 odd years ago, I'd need to go to university and stay there and get my doctorate, right, to become a research scientist. So those opportunities are, in many respects, they feel to me like they're rather more closed. And I think that there needs to be, into this new economy that we're building around science and tech, there needs to be entry points for everyone. And I don't think we're thinking strongly enough about how there is that entry point, because what that means is that many of these sectors and opportunities are closed off for many people. There are not those routes. And so as much as it's about going into a school and talking about these are the opportunities and these are the things that you need to do, I think we need a bigger pool of opportunity as well.
And I'd have to completely agree with that, because we've seen a job market over the last few years that has been uncertain.
Yeah.
Organisations aren't necessarily confident of what will be and how can they invest in apprenticeship schemes or graduate schemes. Yeah. But equally, I've seen, it's only 8 years since I had schools coming into my offices in Nottingham at the time.
Yeah.
We were doing a lot around apprenticeships. I remember somebody saying to me, I didn't realise that the jobs that were in the tech space weren't just developers.
Indeed.
But there is that broader, any business.
And they're businesses,
got a broad range.
Right? They're businesses. And so you'd expect to see a broad range of opportunities and occupations, in that type of business. But it does also, I think, the other dimension to this, and the conversation that I would have in schools, is around those STEM, science, technology, engineering, and maths skills and qualifications. As an economy in the UK, compared to our international competitors, we have a smaller proportion of students who are studying those subjects that are choosing careers in those areas. I think some of those are at those cutting edge growth parts of the economy. My advice to students would be, think very deeply about the choices that you make. I was very fortunate to be that kid who got bought the chemistry set at age 7, because I grew up in a household that had huge amount of love, but actually not a lot of academic direction or career direction. I think I was just lucky that I found something that I was interested in. I think we need to have a more of a planned conversation with kids and with students about what's the future shape of the economy. What are the things that you should be thinking about studying, and by all means, it's important to follow your passions, to your earlier point, but actually develop a passion if you can in some of those areas. If you're beginning of an interest, develop it, because actually these are the things that are really important for the country and would enable you to build a very resilient career as well.
I guess the obvious question is, what is the modern day chemistry set? Because part of it, ought we to be giving Claude licenses to kids to enable them to kind of be developing things on Claude code? Suno licenses for those who are musical to create more. So it's, I guess, as it's always, it's access to opportunity, isn't it?
It is. And, it can be serendipitous, of course, but I think we should be thinking more about what is it that we need to do to get children and students more interested in what's the future shape of the economy, where are the opportunities going to come. These are important for all of them as individuals, but it's important for us as a country in terms of, how does our economy develop? And these are big questions about how do we pay our way in the world. One of the things that really concerns me is the extent to which, when we were growing up, we'd hear politicians talk about the balance of payments all the time. Well, you need to sell enough services and goods in the world and export and be able to do that, to be able to buy everything that you want to buy. This is a really important part of having enough demand in the economy for people to have higher living standards, and building the right economy that we can meet that export requirement, fulfill it, make the earnings in the world, and be able to increase our living standards. I think other countries in the world, United States really understands that. I'm not sure that we do quite get that. Sometimes it is about following your interests and passions, but actually, you can do that to a certain degree, but your interests and passions also need to be tempered into fruitful pursuit of other things that we want to do in life, and particularly prosperity and so forth, and particularly in regions like the East Midlands.
In a sense, as you talk, I was utterly by chance in Finland last week, in Helsinki, and in Helsinki I go into this kind of big library, and it's not just got books in, it's got every kind of 3D printer or thermal printer or recording studio or anything, and it's all free.
Well, that's fascinating.
That enables that. It comes back to access to opportunity. How do you actually different environment, different tax regime, etc.
But a very active state as well. A very kind of a lot more thinking about how do we plan for the economy that we're going to have. Very different country, smaller population, and so forth. But I think we can learn a lot from Scandinavia, personally.
Absolutely. Yeah. So we're sat on or in a trading estate or industrial estate in Mansfield at the moment as we do this, and there are lots of businesses around that are of that type. And I guess we've talked about young people and kind of coming into the workforce. But one of the things that I'm fascinated about is those who are 30 or 40 and have done something for many years, but have still got many years ahead of them.
Yeah.
Now, in some of the work I've been doing globally, research work around digital capabilities, digital transformation, digital responsibility, thinking about the impact of the technology choices that we make, I know that many of those SME organisations don't have kind of hordes of people who understand the tech. And therefore there's this gap between all this stuff going on, but what does it mean for them? How can we help those organisations kind of reach into that new art of the possible that helps them to evolve? Because I suspect that most of them are going to be impacted in some way, and that itself is an opportunity.
It is, and look, I think that this is, in many respects, it's a transition again in the economy that we need to make sure that we manage in an equitable way. I think it's really important that we think about, first of all, how can every business benefit from this transition? I think that there is a lot that we can do in terms of the transformation around productivity. I think if we get this right, I think if we bridge the productivity gap, and it's a significant weakness across the UK economy, bridging that gap makes us all better off. So I think it's important that we recognise the opportunity this presents to us, but it is a transformation at the same time, and we need to make sure that everyone, this is not just, as you point out, about people who are entering the labour market, it's about those that are there already, and it is thinking about how do we provide the right kind of skill base, the right kind of training to people who are already in work. Of course, government has responsibility in that, but so do employers if they're going to benefit from that transition. It should be about how do we free up time, how do we become more productive in workplaces and in businesses right across the whole economy. That means, I think, that it gives people more time to actually do some of those front-facing, customer-focused tasks. I know when I talk particularly to people in Mansfield, they're very concerned about wanting to speak to someone who's a human being. Well, potentially this gives us that space to open up some of those opportunities. So I would say to businesses, think about what does this look like for customer service, for how you face your customers as well.
There's a guy who you may well remember, Steve Smith. He used to jump over a bar, high jump.
Yeah, sure.
British record holder.
Yeah.
Joined me on the podcast. He's got a business.
Yes.
And I said, Steve, why did you do that? Why did you adopt AI? It was to make my people incredible. And which I love. It's that, how do we shift it from being something to fear to being something to superpower people across the organisation, to give them the capability to do the things that they're passionate about, or their job in the way that they want to do it.
And it is, of course, a lot of this is automation, and intertwined with this question is the whole question about robotics and the transformation that also might imply for businesses, and particularly for things like distribution businesses. If you put AI and robotics together, it is it's a challenging frontier, I think, for transforming businesses. That transition, real potential for galloping ahead in productivity, but we need to make sure that is managed in an equitable way. We've been through a transition in Nottinghamshire. We went through an energy transition where effectively, our modernisation was to a more precarious form of employment, often in things like distribution and care and so forth. I think one of the things that I'm really concerned that government has to step into is making sure that this transition is equitable, that actually we take people who are already in the labour market along with us, that they have a role in this that is a really strong role about better opportunity rather than being left by the wayside. I think there are a whole series of alternative paths that we can take as a country, and actually it's going to impact the economy globally. These decisions will be taken in organisations that really impact the future of work and what our working lives look like in a incredible way. And I think we're heading really into a transformation of which potentially we've never seen, the impact that it will have on livelihoods. There are a set of paths that we can take, and look, I think it's really important. I think as someone who's a Labour politician and a Social Democrat, I believe that actually we have to take everyone with us, and it has to be about how do we raise living standards across the board rather than a concentration of wealth.
I completely agree, and one of the things that I've personally kind of been getting involved in is some of the thinking at a global level on what does human flourishing look like?
Yeah, sure.
How do we kind of envision that future in a way that actually brings people on the ground wherever they are, the feeling that somebody cares about them and that somebody's trying to help them make a difference. It's a big challenge, but I guess that's why you're doing what you're doing, because to your point, having had that career, that insight, you're now kind of effectively saying, how can I help? How can I help the region? How can I help people connect into that opportunity? So if we finish with, I guess, kind of looking forward, and a lot, I mean, you've talked about a lot of those things, but what would your call out to be those who are listening, maybe in the region, outside the region, to help achieve some of that growth of opportunity, connecting people to that opportunity through skills transfer, etc.? What would that vision look like, and how could somebody help make a difference?
Well, look, I think that we need to think really strongly about what does regional policy look like. These questions about how you get to a more balanced economy across the regions. Some of that is about production. It's about manufacturing. It's about how do we get back to making things. And then there are some of the kind of equity questions about how do we make sure that we take everybody in the labour market with us? How do we provide the right kind of opportunities for students? How do we harness some of these technological developments that are coming along incredibly rapidly? One of the challenges for policymakers is policy moves more slowly. I think that's a real challenge. I think we've shown how we can move quickly. When we had the challenge of large and important parts of the steel industry falling apart and being shut down, we moved really quickly and we came into Parliament on a Saturday and legislated and put an Act of Parliament right through in a day. Well, I think there needs to be some more urgency on the part of policymakers. I think we're getting to the point of a fundamental change in the way that we view some of these technologies and their capabilities, and that move to agentic AI is coming, the timescale is coming down. I think that policymakers and governments need to think really carefully about how they manage that and the impact that it has on people's lives. So, my shout out really to people in the region is think about what that transformation looks like, talk to policymakers, get engaged in the discussion. If you have the time out of your day job, think about what does it take for you to flourish in this future, and have that conversation with people like me. And I'm very open to that. I think there are a number of us that are, but let's talk about that rapidly.
Fantastic. Steve, it's been a pleasure talking to you on the podcast.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.